So, as many of you know, there's a famous anecdote told about a meeting between a prominent Russian Jew and the German historian of Judaism, Leopold Zunz, who in 1819 founded the Society for the Culture and Science of the Jews, out of which grew the movement known as Wissenschaft des Judentum, the science of Judaism. The Wissenschaft movement produced the scholarship out of which grew the modern study of Judaism as we know it, what we see thriving at Jewish studies departments in our universities. It's also entered It's also entered the popular imagination, or I suppose my imagination at least, for being an objective method of looking at Jewish texts and history, a neutral, perhaps even clinical approach that values detachment of the scholar from the subject matter that he or she investigates. Now, that may or may not be fair to the movement, but the story of Zunz and the Russian Jewish man of letters demonstrates this sort of view quite well. It's probably an apocryphal story, people tell me, but nonetheless. Okay, so the story goes, Zunz, the German scholar, asks the Russian guest to Berlin what he does, and he receives the answer, "I'm a Hebrew poet," to which Zunz responds dryly, "When did you live?" Now, Tikvah's approach to the study of Judaism might well be called contra-Wissenschaftian, if that's not too barbaric for you. We applaud the work of the inheritors of the Wissenschaft tradition, the work that's done in the universities and sees itself proudly in the spirit of this tradition is good work, putting Jewish texts in their historical context, looking at, in an unbiased way, at Jewish history, applying scientific methods of social science research to Judaism, and doing so without any presupposition about the personal engagement of the scholars involved. But within our four walls, we have a different aim. We, you might say, aim to discover where the work of the great scholars and teachers that we bring meets their biography. It's kind of easy to put it this way. We try to get an answer to the question, why do you care about these texts so much? And what significance does living Judaism have for your researches into the product of the Jewish mind and Jewish creativity that we've received from the past? There's a quotation from a teacher of mine, much beloved teacher, Eva Brand, totally outside of the Jewish context, that I like to throw at students. She's describing teaching, and she says, "Teaching itself is indeed above all the controlled public display of delight. A teacher is a lover in chief, prepared not only to be observed in the activity of love, but to beckon students into it." So that's the contra-Wissenschaftian motto, I say. So let me introduce our speakers. Professor Christine Hayes is a professor of religious studies in classical Judaica at Yale University. She's a incredible teacher and a great scholar who's produced numerous books and articles. You can read about what she's produced in her biography. Her most recent book, is it done? The Divine Law?
Yes, it's sitting with the press when they get it.
What's So Divine About Divine Law provides a lot of the material for what she's teaching in the Institute with us here at Tikvah. She's also sort of an online course superstar, having been a featured instructor for one of the Yale Open Lecture Series, and I think one of the most popular, if not the most popular one in that series, on a course on the Old Testament. That's what it was called.
I didn't pick that up.
Professor Hayes has an incredible ability to teach rabbinic texts to students, and I've seen this in action so many times that it's become a well-established fact that she is truly a living master in this area. Rabbi Yehoshua Pfeffer was born and educated in London and then came to Israel as a young man to study in yeshiva, as many of you did, I believe. He stayed on in Israel, achieving a lot of success and renown in his yeshiva studies. Moved from the yeshiva he originally arrived at to the Mir yeshiva, and had enough success that it seemed like the calling of his life. became a rabbinic judge, dayan, in a court, and started a family. And then at a certain point decided that it served his interest to go to Hebrew University and in a very real way blaze a trail to Hebrew University for intellectuals, high-achieving intellectuals within the haredi community. He, after getting his degree in law from Hebrew University, he was a clerk on the Supreme Court of Israel. He's in the last year doing that. Worked with Ruth Gavison in matters of religion and state, and the good work that Ruth Gavison does, and was a student like you all are in a summer fellowship program of Tikvah's 2 years ago, and now has done much other good work with Tikvah. So he too cares a lot about rabbinic texts. So we brought together for you two individuals who are great teachers and thinkers, and we'd like to do something a bit experimental with our time together this evening. It's not a typical panel. What I'd like to do is spend the first chunk of time, I have written down in a very disciplined way how much time, hearing from each one of them about their own personal biography. And forgive me if this sounds cheesy, but I have the Eva Brand quotation in mind. I would like to ask them both to tell us their love story with the Talmud. I think that would be quite illuminating, and hopefully to tell us a little bit about why they care about the text so much and how it came to occupy such a special place for them. And I might provoke them with a couple back and forths. I know both of them pretty well. And we'll do that for about 50 minutes or so, and then we're going to do something we don't usually do in the panels. We're going to ask each of them to teach. It's going to be like a speed round, speed shiur. Each one gets 15 to 20 minutes to teach a text that you have a handout in front of you, gives you an idea what they'll be teaching. Professor Hayes will go first and teach text for 15 to 20 minutes, and then Rabbi Pfeffer will do the same, and then we'll hear each one comment on the approach that the other took and some of the ideas that they brought to the table, and hopefully we'll still have some time left over for questions from you. So, Rabbi Pfeffer, why don't you begin? I'd like to just put the question to you. How did you fall in love with the Talmud?
Thank you, Alan, for the warm introduction. So yeah, like Alan said, I grew up in a suburb of London, and till I was 16, 17 years old, I studied in a Jewish high school, like probably most of you. I was an Orthodox Jewish high school, but it wasn't a romance of anything to write home about with regard to Talmudics. However, this began really when I came to yeshiva. I came to study in yeshiva in Israel, in Jerusalem, and I have to say the love affair, if you want, or the falling in love, wasn't at the beginning only with the Talmudic text as a rabbinic text, and later this came, and I'll speak about that soon. But it was more about the Talmudic system, the Talmudic system of life that I encountered when I came to yeshiva. Coming to yeshiva, and this was even more true when I came to Mir Yeshiva, which was a little bit later, but even before that stage, I was enthralled and enamored, I have to say, with the concept of a study framework that is really all-encompassing and goes way beyond the actual intellectual pursuit of the text itself, but really bears upon each and every aspect of a person's life, both in a very personal sense and in terms of how we try to mold and to build a just and fair society. So it was really the totality, I would say the totality of the system that at first took me, or that engaged me in a very deep way. And after a while, I saw that totality of the Talmudic system as a way of life was very meaningful as an intellectual pursuit, as a yeshiva boy, looking for depth and looking for profundity. So I found that I could really feel a sense of connection with the Talmudic studies that I was engaged in, beyond any other kind of studies that I had ever experienced before. And again, this was both on a level of intellectual stimulation. Once you experience the depth and the breadth and the particular, the special kind of analysis, the back and forth, the question and answer, the very fine tunings that you have in Talmudic thinking. Once you experience that, then I think anybody who knows that intimately can understand the falling in love. But again, it's also the commitment to it. As a young man, as a young adult, I remember the sleepless nights that we used to spend in the Beit Midrash, in the study hall, just working our way, plowing through the different passages that we were studying in the Talmud. And this was really, we really experienced on a first-hand level, on a real living experience, the words that we use in the prayers, for these are our lives and the length of our days. These were really our lives, meaning this was really everything for me. I mean, I can tell you, just as an interesting anecdote, the schedule that I used to have, when it wasn't so much wasn't yet a total system, and you'll see why. The schedule that I had on Thursday nights was, we used to add a great learning partner, somebody from Atlanta, Georgia. Would you believe, down south? But he was great, and no offense. And we used to start learning Thursday evening after Ma'ariv, after the evening prayers. We used to sit and learn. We used to just learn through the night, just the two of us sitting, plowing away, trying to understand deeper, trying to clarify the different elements of the passage and to fit them together. So we learned all the way through to the morning prayers, to Shacharit. And then following that, and this is before I came to Mir, and then we did away with the next part, but following that we actually went and played tennis in the morning right after davening through to like midday, and then we used to finish like a big tub of ice cream and then go to sleep a bit. And then in Mir I picked it up, but then we didn't do the tennis anymore. And that was the totality of the...
Keep the ice cream though.
No, the ice cream was with the tennis. Now I do the ice cream without the tennis. But again, and following on from that yeshiva experience, this immersion, a total immersion in Torah study, and in Talmud, again, both as a study system, which is all-encompassing, it really takes over, or took over, my own life, and as by way of application, meaning you both study the Talmud, and you also apply it in a practical sense, because the Talmud isn't just an exercise in intellectual studies or intellectual, recreational activity or serious intellectual activity, but it's also, for the yeshiva student, it's also a way of life in terms of applying those lessons that you learn in the Talmud to your everyday life. And this was the amazing thing, that as I developed more in my own Talmudic experience and erudition, so I was able to see that even for a young Talmudic scholar, you could find your own niche, if you want, in the Talmudic literature, and find your own novellae, your own novel ideas that you can propose and put forward and write down, and then actually live by them. Meaning this is part of your, if it's not the daily schedule, then it's part of the religion, if you want. The Jewish religion is not a religion of faith, it's a religion of practice. And that practice is almost entirely Talmud-based. So that go-between, between the study on the one hand and the praxis on the other, was something that also just, kept on accompanying me all the way through. So in the beginning, while I was in yeshiva, I still kept, I still had a university place in London that waited for me all these years, and I deferred it year after year, and they were very patient, they were very nice with me, they always allowed me to defer. But in the end, I think it was me that gave up on them, and I decided to really make I would say, dedicate my life at that stage. That was the decision, to really dedicate my life to the system of Talmudic immersion, of being, this totality of the Talmudic system, both in terms of an intellectual pursuit and in terms of the practical application. And that's what Alan mentioned. I specialized in the civil law of the Talmud, which is a very, very broad branch of Talmudics. It includes a whole wealth of tractates and of Talmudic experience and learning. And becoming a judge on a civic rabbinical court was, for me, it was just incredible, because I was able to actually implement and apply all of that Talmudic study that I had been doing at the highest level. Actually hearing real life cases of two litigants that are coming to court and having some dispute, whether it's in neighborly affairs or if it's contract law or damages or any branch of civil law, including very sometimes odd and bizarre cases that you really have to think about, where am I going to find the president and the Talmudic president to decide this case? And this was just fantastic, because you have to really dig down, find those reserves of your long experience in Talmudic learning and thought, and find how you're going to decide these cases. So this is I would say this is more or less the love affair for me. I think a love affair is a very appropriate expression for the relationship. That's the time?
No,
Thanks.
that wasn't me. But
okay, I'll ignore it then. I think it's an appropriate term, because it's really, at least from the yeshiva system, it's all embracing, and just like when you fall in love, so that captivates you and it takes you over. So that's really the kind of feeling that you have in yeshiva, just studying the whole time. I remember Shabbat afternoons, you finish, in me yeshiva we used to finish eating like the meal at 10 o'clock, and then just study straight through to the afternoon prayer session, which is like 6, 7 in the afternoon, just studying straight through, and like nothing else matters. It was just an incredible experience where you have this yeshiva that kind of shelters you from anything else, and you don't have to. I didn't even know the street names around the yeshiva. This was the extent of how immersed you can be in the Talmud. So that's how it was for me. I hope the description can resonate with some of you. I'll hand over to Christine.
okay, Christine.
Thank you. So it all began on December 6, 1960. I was born So I guess a little bit of biographical background as well. I grew up in a lot of different places, so it's very difficult for me to answer the question where you come from. I think I lived in 3 different houses before I was 1 year old, and so there were lots of places before I can remember where I lived. So my first memories began in Virginia, but a lot of my real growing up happened in Australia, because my parents are Australian. So at a certain point, they moved back there when I was about 11. So I grew up in Australia, which is, I think, one of the reasons why I love being in Israel, because I remember the first time I went there, I stepped off the plane and thought, this is exactly like home. The colors and the eucalyptus and the smells and the sounds and everything, just the gold and the reds and the drab greens and gray greens. And anyway, so I just always have this, I love a sunburnt country, as they say in Australia, and Israel is one of those. So I grew up not really knowing people who were Jewish, not really knowing anything about Judaism. And yet, oddly enough, even though the culture that I grew up in was a somewhat monolithic culture, my own home was really not that. My father and my mother were both people who were very interested in the world. My father is probably the person I admire most in the world, and he was orphaned when he was 12, and a very self-made person. And someone who was just fascinated with humanity, and eventually put himself through high school and university and ended up with a PhD in philosophy, but also studied world religions. So I do remember that I would come home from school sometimes and there would be, a Buddhist monk in an orange robe in our living room. Or there would be an imam, or there was a rabbi in our town, actually. There was a very small Jewish community, very, very small in the town that we lived in Australia, but I certainly didn't have any peers or anyone that I knew. So I always had this sense of the world as being a place full of interesting people and interesting ideas and interesting cultures beyond the sort of what I felt was a very uninteresting and monolithic culture that I was growing up in. And I apologize to those who may have heard a couple of these stories before, but I left Australia and came to the United States for university. And for those of you who live here, it may sound like a bit of a cliche, but this country really is a melting pot in a way that other countries are not. And it's fascinating to people who come from other countries that there can be so many ideas and cultures in this land. So even though I went to a very elite undergraduate institution, I was still encountering people and cultures that I had never had an opportunity to encounter before, and that was an exciting thing for me. I left Australia very much thinking, if you want to picture me at the age of 16, 17, 18, just picture Hermione from Harry Potter. You know, that was me. I was the overachiever. I was the one who wanted to know everything and just studied all night, and I would have given my eye tooth for a time turner. So, if you know what that is. So that's who I was. I was just a very thirsty, eager, hardworking, overachieving kind of kid, but I also was a great lover of people and humanity. I can't really explain very well some of the things that happened in my undergraduate years, but I can tell you that in freshman week at my freshman orientation at Harvard, when every organization on campus is having their open houses and trying to attract freshman interest, I was walking along Mount Auburn Street and there were lights on in a building and clearly some sort of open house, and I went in because I always did that, and I went in everywhere and talked to everybody. And it turned out that they had this pink stuff called lox I'd never seen before, and bagels and cream cheese that I had never seen before. It was the Harvard Hillel, and it was a Friday afternoon, and there were Kabbalat Shabbat services that were going to happen. So I stayed for dinner and I stayed for the service, and it was the first time I had been to any kind of Jewish worship service. And it was fascinating. I remember sitting there, and as I didn't know it at the time, I realized later that it was an egalitarian minyan. Everyone sat in a circle, which I thought was an interesting choreography. And I really thought it was interesting the way people kind of moved in and out of solitary moments and then coming together. And everyone seemed to know exactly when to come together and to start saying things, and then they would recede into their own private progress through this book, and I was fascinated by that. I was fascinated by the way there was both community and solidarity as well as individuality within that, and I liked it. There was a sense of calm about it. There was a sense of, I also liked the fact that at no point was anyone required to stand up and recite a creed, which is one of the things that I resented very much about some of the upbringing that I had had. And so I started to go every Friday night, and in fact, all through my undergraduate years and graduate school, I went to Kabbalat Shabbat services every Friday night. I didn't want to look real different, so I decided to take one of those classes they have at the Hillel where you learn how to read the Aleph Bet and you learn how to read Hebrew. You don't know what it is you're reading, but you just learn to read it. So I took one of those, and I'm very musical, so within about 2 months I could pretty much daven the whole Amidah and get away with it. And I'm looking at the English on the other side to make sure that I'm okay with the things that I'm saying. Because I wanted to be intellectually honest. But I really appreciated those Friday nights, and it was there was a great arc in the week for me, and I really enjoyed that, and it was something that I did, as I said, all through my undergraduate and graduate years. So that was one part of something that was happening in my life. The other part of what was happening in my life was at the more intellectual level, which was I was searching for a major. And I had always been really interested in the big ideas. I wanted to understand the stories that humans tell about why we're here and who we are and what the point of all of this is, the deep existential questions. And I thought that I would find those in philosophy. So I thought I would be a philosophy major. To be a philosophy major, you have a prerequisite of Logic 101, or whatever it's called. And I remember sitting through a couple of classes of if P then Q and thinking, these are not the great ideas. It's just math and words, and I hated math in high school, and I'm not going to do this. So I refused to do the prerequisite, so I couldn't be a philosophy major. So I decided that possibly the great ideas would be accessible. And in literature, after all, I'd come the top of my state in Australia in English literature and ancient history. Those were things that I'd always loved very, very much. And literature, that's where the big ideas would be found. But unfortunately at Harvard, the literature, the English major, requires a prerequisite in Chaucer. And I think Chaucer's really just a dirty old man. I just don't think that, because it's the only thing we have in Middle English, it doesn't mean it's worth reading, you know, so I couldn't see myself getting through a semester of Chaucer. So the English major was out. And then I stumbled upon the study of religion. And I realized that the study of religion brought me everything that I loved, all the things that I had labored over, burning the midnight oil in high school because I loved so much. Ancient history had always been fascinating to me. Languages, I loved languages, texts, just reading and interpreting texts, and literature and the ideas in literature and the big existential questions. And I realized this is everything. For someone like me who loves all of these disciplines, the study of religion is perfect. Within that, you had to choose a focus. So at first, I focused on Judaism and Islam. And it became very, very clear to me within about 3 weeks that I was spending all of my time on my Judaism classes. And I really wasn't that interested in anything else. And so eventually, I focused just on Judaism. And I remember taking a class somewhere in my perhaps sophomore year. That was one of these aha moments in your life. And I don't know that I don't know that I recognized it as such at the time. I think I did actually recognize it as such at the time. This was a course that was taught by the late Isidore Tversky. He taught a course on Jewish history from the fall of the Roman Empire unto the Enlightenment. And I remember in the opening lecture he said, if you've ever taken a course in Western history, then you've studied a certain canon of historical interpretation. You've studied a certain sequence of events, cause and effect. It's a narrative about Western history. It's standard. And if you've learned anything about the Jews along the way, it's just been kind of tacked on coincidentally. So, and in the Crusades, many Jews were killed, right? He said, in this class, we're going to invert that paradigm, and we're going to study the events of Jewish history as if they have a coherence and a thread and a causality, and that there's a narrative there to tell. And when you do that, you see that events of Western history will appear very differently. So the year 1492 is going to mean something different to you after this class. And I felt like someone had lifted my head up off my shoulders, turned it around, and put it back down. And it was the most exciting feeling I've ever had. And I remember saying to myself, there are parallel universes out there, and how dare I go through this life and not be aware of the radically different experience others have. And you know what, this particular other, for whatever reason, this particular other is the one that grabs me. And I can't really explain that. You know, people want you to explain, can you explain why you fell in love with the person who is your partner? It's not always easy. You can point to really nice things about them, but it's very, very hard. I don't know why. I don't know why that was the one I was always burning the midnight oil for. I don't know why that was the one that I went to no end, of trouble to get to know more. But I loved that I remember sort of thinking to myself, I want to step inside that world. To me, that would be the greatest thing, to be able to really look at the world from inside that paradigm and look out, to really understand what it would be like to have that experience of the world and of the universe and of life. So I think that must have been some sort of little internal moment that I had, which made it clear to me that this was probably something I would be engaged in pretty regularly for the rest of my life. But rabbinic literature was not something you could study at Harvard University, primarily because of Isidore Tversky, who didn't feel that there was a place in the academic world for the study of rabbinic literature. The Bible, fine, the Bible's not a sacred text, but for people like Tversky, it's the Talmud, right? That's the sacred text. That's the one you want to keep your academic hands off of. So I couldn't really do that there, but I studied Hebrew Bible. I began to study Hebrew as well. I actually took time off in my junior year, and I went and I lived for 8 months on a kibbutz in Israel, and which was also a very wonderful experience for me. And I took courses in medieval Jewish philosophy and modern Judaism, but all the time I just had this nagging feeling that I was missing the heart and soul of it. And I remember going to speak to Isidore Tversky at the end of my undergraduate years when I was thinking about perhaps going into this as an academic profession. And part of me was thinking, you're out of your mind. That's just insane. You can't possibly, you'll never be taken seriously. You can't do this. And part of me said, I don't care. I've never cared about whether or not anybody takes me seriously. I know what I want to do when I wake up in the morning. And when I wake up in the morning, I want to open these books and read them. So it really doesn't matter to me whether anybody else wants me to do it or thinks I can. It's what I'm going to be doing with the hours of my day. So I went to talk to him about graduate study, and I said, if I do this, though, what I want to do is rabbinics and Talmud, because I feel that really is the heart and soul of it, and everything that comes after is, if it's not a continuation or a development or an elaboration of it, then it's a reaction to it or a resistance to it or it's a wrestling with it. But Rabbinic Judaism is really the crucible out of which everything is formed. And all of the great ideas in Jewish thought and all of the great expressions, because I think there's more than just ideas, right? But all of the great expressions of Jewish religious culture really come out of that crucible, and I want to understand it. And he said to me, well, if you knew how much work lay in front of you, you probably wouldn't do it, so it's a good thing you don't know. which I took as a blessing. And he wrote a letter of recommendation for me. And it took me 2.5 years, though. It took me 2.5 years to decide that this is what I wanted to do. Because there was another big part of me that was very dedicated to social service. I did a lot of social service work, and that was something I thought I would perhaps do. And so I did that for a while. But one of the things I realized is that, unlike many of the other people in this room, Judaism and Jewishness are not in my life if I don't put them there. That's not true of many people in this room. You can go play tennis and eat ice cream. It doesn't remove any of the Jewishness from your life. There's no Jewishness and no Judaism in my life unless I put it there. So after 2 years or 2.5 years of working and having many, many hours of my day taken over doing other work and feeling this tremendous absence and this tremendous sense that there was something that was desperately missing and that I was unhappy about, I decided that I really had to be spending all of my time doing this. And I went back to school, and I went to graduate school at Berkeley and spent my second year of graduate school at the Hebrew University, taking as many classes as one can humanly fit into a schedule within a year at the Hebrew University, courses in Yerushalmi and Bavli and Midrash Halacha and various other things, and lots of Mechina Talmud classes. And then also was lucky enough to have someone, Yaakov Zussman from the Hebrew University, come back to Berkeley the following year to work with me on graduate seminar and to put together my dissertation topics. So I was very lucky to be able to pull together the resources of Hebrew University, Berkeley, and actually also Yale, where I was able to spend a year when Shaya Gafni was there, and so on. And so, look, these things are all, we're never one thing. We are lots of different things. And so the things that you love are things that engage you on many, many levels, right? They engage you intellectually, they engage you emotionally, they engage you spiritually. They engage your sense of humor. I happen to have a very big sense of humor. So if something can't make me laugh now and again, that's important to me. I need to be able to laugh, and I think rabbinic texts are wonderfully, cleverly funny often. I hope to show you that in the teaching that I'm doing. So that's a little bit of the story. I don't know if all of those pieces add up to something that makes sense. If you were to ask me what my relationship with this tradition is, I would have to say I have no idea. I just know that when I wake up in the morning, it's the first thing on my mind, and when I go to bed at night, it's probably the last thing I've been doing before I turn out the light. So I don't know if you want to
Thank you
follow up.
very much. So let me put a question to each of you, inspired by your remarks. And I'm going to ask them both and then give you each a chance to respond. Yeshua, Professor Hayes talked about the reluctance of Isidore Twersky to see the Talmud be part of the Harvard curriculum. And that's an understandable reluctance from a certain traditional point of view. I mean, the challenging of the tradition's notion of the authorship and the dating of the text and how it's been transmitted is something that would seem to be potentially threatening to the authoritative status of the text. But on the other hand, it seems to be something that anybody who's really interested in the truth would want to pursue and know about and be clear as could be about. So I wonder if you are curious or driven to approach the Talmud in that way. I know I knocked Wissenschaft the Dugentum, but now I'm trying to resuscitate it. If you yourself, in your love of the Talmud, want to know certain of these more academic type questions about it, but which are motivated by wanting to know the truth as conceived from outside of the tradition about the text. Chris, I wanted to ask you, when Yeshua talks about the Talmud as a guiding, normative, organizing force of life beyond its beauty and its inspirational quality, I wonder if how you reckon with that. I mean, and I also took note of one of your other great passions, the social service work, which I know is not something that you gave up when you returned to Judaism, but that you still very much engage with. And that there are those who see the Talmud really in that way as sort of a way to guide them in deciding what the best human good is and how they should spend their time as a responsible human being. And I don't know if that's a part of what the Talmud means for you, or if you take your moral bearings, let's say, from elsewhere. So Yehoshua, could you?
Yeah, I'll be happy to expand on that a little bit. I think when I can't speak for Isildur per se, but what I can imagine disturbed him in a deeper sense about academic involvement with the Talmud wasn't only the possibility that some scholarly research might actually expose the Talmud as being, predated to when it was really written, or perhaps some of the people who are quoted there didn't really say what they are recorded to have said, or something like that. I think the concern goes much deeper than that, and that concern would also answer the question about whether I am concerned for this issue of academic involvement and research as to authenticity and dating and all these kind of things, because in the traditional world, and certainly in the yeshiva world, so the way in which Talmud is studied is very much as a one-directional motion of study from the text to the person who's studying the text. The Talmud itself, I'll explain what I mean. The Talmud itself makes this very clear-cut statement whereby the correct manner, again, according to the Talmud, this is a bit of like self-reflection, but the method by which Talmud should be studied is to study the Talmud with the intention of knowing how to behave, how to act, with the intention of deriving, extracting guidance for normative behavior from the Talmudic text. And the Talmud goes so far as to state that somebody who doesn't study the Talmud in this way, but rather studies it just as a detached intellectual pursuit, is doing a misservice to the Talmud. It's better that he shouldn't study at all, in the words of the Talmud. And that's a very powerful statement about what Talmud is about for the traditional person or for the yeshiva world. Talmud is about studying for the sake of knowing and for the sake of having a normative guidance to your life. And when you go into the academic realm, so the whole notion of Talmudic studies or studies about anything is very much the reverse. It's not so much from the text to the person you're studying, analyzing the text in order to reach a conclusion for normative behavior, but rather it's the person going to the text, taking it apart, and analyzing it for the sake of breaking apart the text. And who was this Rabbi Yochanan? Who was this historical figure? What they're saying is certainly interesting, and we want to know also in academia what the people are saying. And sometimes we have a very keen interest in putting together different pieces of the puzzle with what they say in other places, and explaining that there's a study hall of Nahar Da'ah of one place and Pumbedita and other places. But for the yeshiva scholar, this really takes away the heart and soul of Talmudic studies, because the heart and soul is really the concept of the Talmud as a guideline to your personal life and behavior. So the fear, if you want, of academic involvement in the Talmud is not only because of what might result from those investigations, but it's the very method by which academia approaches the Talmud as opposed to the method that's employed in the yeshiva world. And for me personally, sometimes I can find the academic investigations interesting, whether it's in historical investigations or philological or any of the different kinds of academic method that's applied to the Talmud, but it's not something that I'm especially, I would say, curious about, or it's not something that really comes to bear in my own pursuit of the Talmud, because for me the Talmud is a canon. It's a canon in the sense that it's not a text that I can break down and say, well, this is historically, perhaps inaccurate, and in fact, it was written in such a time, and it wasn't really written by Rebbe or by somebody else, the Mishnah, for example, but rather, all of this goes a little bit over my head, because for me this is a canon that defines a way of life. And once you have a canon that defines your way of life, it's not something that you begin to analyze. You know, when a parent tells you, go get me a glass of water, say, well, you know, my father's saying that because he was abused when he was a kid, and, you know, it's a historical thing, and, you know, and really a glass of water, he doesn't really mean a glass of water, you know, you just go and get the glass of water. So that's more or less the approach with the Talmud. Obviously, we learn it in as deep as possible and as intricate as possible, and to really try to understand the depth of the seas of the Talmud, but always with having in mind this direction, this motion, that is from the text to the person and not the other way.
Thank you.
Where should I begin? So, fortunately, these things are not mutually exclusive. Fortunately, all human beings are complex organisms, and we all do very many things. I don't know if any of you are performers at all, either singing or acting or anything. I'm a singer, so I do a lot of singing. And I have a lot of musical knowledge. And so when I do a lot of close a cappella 4-part harmony. And the first thing that I do when I do close, and I also directed a women's chorus for 10 years. So, and I drove a bus too. Why don't we put it all in there? I actually drove a bus and had a cooking business for 6 months. And yes, anyway. But when I first get a score, you know, the analysis begins. Which of these chords is a major, minor, seventh, because those are the ones I want to sit on. Which of these, etc. There's the technical analysis. There's all the aspect. There's breaking down. We analyze the lyrics. We'll create a backstory to motivate the character as she's singing that particular song. A lot of, which one's the left brain, which is the right, I never remember. A lot of left brain is at the analytic side, a lot of right brain, I forget. But there's a lot of right brain activity, But then the moment comes when you begin to enter into the song, right? And you start singing it, and you start to hear the harmonies. And when you hear it, that's very different from looking at the 4 notes that are on the staff that you're trying to analyze as a chord. I know what a major, minor, seventh sounds like, but when I hear 4 courses really lock it and ring it, that's a whole different experience from knowing what it is on the piece of paper, right? And you rehearse, and you get it perfect until finally you're setting up overtones because you're matching so beautifully. And you walk out on that stage, and you deliver a performance. And I hope nobody in that audience can see any of the technicality that went into what we just did. Okay, that's a great performance. That's when you transcend all of the technicalities and all the analysis, and you arrive at some sort of sublime moment of experience. And to me, that's very much what I do when I study. I think that the analytics do have to be there. I think it's dishonest for it not to be. I can't be other than who I am with this text, and I happen to be a smart person who asks a lot of questions. I can't help it. When I sit down with a text, I want to know who, what, where, why, when, in conversation with what. What were other people saying in other communities at the same time? What did they think about the same issues? What would it have meant to say these words in the 1st century versus what it would have meant to say those words in the 7th century? Did it take intellectual courage in the 1st century and not at all in the 7th century? I want to know those things. And I can't help it. Those are just the questions I ask. And I want to do all that analysis, but at the end of the day, the Talmud has put something together that is a performance, and I don't use those words lightly. To me, performances are almost sacred things. I know how much work goes into a really sublime performance where you surrender yourself to the art of what you're doing. And if you surrender yourself to the artistry of what the Talmudist has done in its final redaction, so you can analyze all the pieces and ask all those questions and get all the data, and then you step back and you look at the orchestrated whole of a particular sugya. And you experience it at another level. And I think that experience of it is the richer for the analysis that you've done, for me anyway. Now, I also think that intellectual tastes are just like any other tastes. I cannot tell you why I love lemon curd. I love lemon curd. I love chocolate. I cannot stand grapefruit. Don't bring it anywhere near me. I don't know why. And I think intellectual tastes are much the same. They are tastes. So I can almost have a religious experience, what I think other people would describe in certain terms as a religious experience when I'm doing certain sorts of things with the Talmudic text that may not be someone else's taste. And that's okay. I think as long as one is always bringing one's best self to the task, whatever that is, your best self intellectually, your best self ethically, your best self, aesthetically, in terms of your aesthetic judgments, as long as you're being serious and bringing your best self to the text, but you can't do anything other than that. I can't bring anything to the text other than who I am, okay? Then that's reverential, that's reverence. That's treating the text with a certain kind of reverence and taking it with the kind of seriousness that I think those who created it would be appreciative of and thankful for. And they're not mutually exclusive. We do all wear very different hats. So I wear one hat when I'm first analyzing that score and figuring out where all the major, minor, seventh chords are, and I'm wearing a different hat when I'm on the stage and I'm performing that songs and trying to move my audience to have a certain experience with that piece of music, which is a transcendent experience, right? And I think it's the same when we study, and I think that studying with a group of people in a certain setting or certain a milieu creates one kind of experience of the text. In other settings, it creates others. And again, I don't see them as mutually exclusive. They line up with different parts of the self-same person sometimes, not just with different kinds of people, but the different kinds of persons each one of us actually all is within ourselves. I have no idea if I answered your question.
You certainly did.
Okay. Well, can I say one other little thing about,
Sure.
And in terms of the Talmud as being a guiding, normative, I'm not going to pretend I don't know the difference between having it actually dictate halachically what you do each day, of course. And I'm not a halachically observant Jew. That's a certain fact about me, which I think is not a secret. So of course it doesn't do that. But I think that there are other ways in which a text can inform the structure of one's day and inform one's ethical thinking and inform other parts of one's life. And I note that that's true not of me only, but of Jews generally. I mean, I have not observed yet that all Jews everywhere have the same normative relationship to this text as one another. There are many, many varieties of relationships with the Talmudic text, which one would call normative and guiding their daily life. And so there's great variety even among the Jewish community. Where I might locate myself within those varieties, there's probably a place there that could be described. So I think that's something to keep in mind sometimes, that there are different ways to have normative or guiding relationships with the text.
All right, well, I appreciate your answer and then your elaboration there. It makes it even more clear. I think, though, that we probably all have a lot of questions, but what I really think is that we should go into each of your respective workshops and see and make vivid for ourselves a little bit what you're talking about. You're talking about your engagement with these texts. So this is the conceit of this session, and let's do it this way. Christine will go first, and I will try to encourage you to stay within the...
Give me a 2-minute warning, and then
give
I'll
you a
just
2-minute
cut to the
warning.
chase.
I know this isn't normally the way we would study, and we would have reversa, and there's all sorts of better ways to do this, but this is sort of our accommodation, and then Yeshua will do the same, and then we'll be able to open it up a little bit.
Okay, so I'm going to actually just first describe to you how it is that I came to think about the things that I think about when I look at these particular texts. So recreate for you what I went through in my own encounter with these texts, and then how I would perhaps teach it. But this really began because I stumbled upon these Halakhic passages which use this phrase, Lo nitna Torah lamalachei hasharet, right? The Torah was not given to ministering angels. And I thought this was an interesting kind of phrase. I thought it was an odd phrase. So I began to hunt around a little bit, and I discovered that this phrase appears only 4 times in the entire Bavli. And that's it. It doesn't appear in Yerushalmi, it doesn't appear in Mishnah, Tosefta, Midrashei Halacha, it doesn't appear anywhere else. Just 4 times in the Bavli, in these 4 sugyot. And it seems at first glance to be saying, it seems to be a concession, right? A concession. We're no angels, you can't expect a certain kind of behavior from us, so lower your expectations. And that struck me as a little bit odd, because I think of Judaism generally, and certainly the Halakhic life and Rabbinic thinking as aspirational, right? Everybody's comfortable with that term, pushing us to strive for a greater perfection, right? Or pushing us to strive for something better. And this seemed to be anti-aspirational. It seemed to be asking us to concede to people's weaknesses or inabilities and not to strive for something. And in fact, if you do a quick Google search, you'll find that that's how it's understood in subsequent Jewish tradition. You look at the number of drashot and homilies and divrei Torah that use this phrase, that's how they use it. Don't expect so much of people. You have to only ask of the public what they can bear, another similar concept from rabbinic literature. And I thought that was really strange because, as I say, I think the biblical tradition is aspirational. Be holy for I, the Lord your God, am holy, right? Imitatio Dei, if not imitatio angelorum, at least it's imitatio Dei, right? Imitating God. And so I decided to look further into this concept, and I thought maybe I need to understand a little bit more about angels and how angels were used in rabbinic literature. And it turns out that angels, ancient people, much like modern people, use angels to think with, and they use angels when they're thinking about what it is to be the best kind of human we can be. Right? So we will use angels to do this. And they did this in antiquity as well. And as I began to dig a little deeper, one of the things I wanted to do, again, was to understand why the Talmud does the things it does. I think it's useful to look at what Jews prior to the rabbis did, what Jews around at the same time as the rabbis, or non-Jews, other groups they might have been talking to. So this is one of the things I'll often do when studying Talmudic texts, is to know what kind of conversation was going on around some of these issues in other parts of the ancient world. So one of the things I found was that in antiquity, there are two different anthropologies, if you will, two different accounts of the human. One which sees humans as pretty much continuous with angels, right? That we're essentially of the same order of being, we're just on a little bit lower rank, but there's a kind of a continuity. And there are certain biblical verses that are favorite verses for people who hold this view. So in Bereshit 1, right, human beings are created in the image, Demut Tselem, the idea of humans being created in the image or likeness of divine beings, or in I've forgotten now, is it Psalm 8? Yes,
Psalm 8.
Yes, Psalm 8, right. You've made him a little lower than Ha-Elohim, right? So these would imply that we're basically continuous with angels, but on a lower rank, which implies that if we just keep moving along that continuous chain, we can be more angelic. We can achieve an angelic perfection. And then there's another view in antiquity, which is that we are discontinuous with angels. We do not strive, we cannot strive. It makes no sense to try to be more angelic, to move, that's not the direction we should be headed. Angels are here, humans are here. We should be striving for a human perfection and not an angelic perfection. What interested me was that I found that the first view, the continuity view, fills the Jewish writings prior to rabbinic literature, prior to the Talmud. When you look at Second Temple Jewish literature, literature such as Jubilees or Enoch, or some of the writings in the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Qumran community, the Qumran community very much modeled the life of the community on what they imagined was the life and activity of the angels in heaven. They wanted to aspire to an angelic perfection, and to them, the perfection of angels consisted primarily of a perfection of the will. That is, the angel's will was perfectly aligned with the will of God. They were perfectly obedient. And so one lived a life of constant prayer and worship. They timed their prayers with the timing of the prayers of the angels in heaven. They say this in their writings. One of the reasons they left Jerusalem to go live off in a bunch of caves in the desert was because the Jews in Jerusalem were not following the God-given calendar, which was a 52-week calendar, was not the calendar corrected, the sun, this lunisolar calendar. It wasn't that calendar. They had a 52-week calendar, which they say was the calendar given at creation. On the seventh day, the angels also rest, and the angels worship God, and they celebrate the festivals. The angels are circumcised, according to these texts. And so humans are circumcised in imitation of the angels. We follow the calendar of the angels. We worship with the angels. And when we unite our prayers with their prayers, we create all sorts of wonderful synergies in the cosmos. So there was this idea, too, that they were very strict about ritual purity. And they say because Kadoshim walk among us, angels, holy ones, sacred ones walk among us, they seem to imagine themselves to have been living with angels and living in imitation and worship of angels. So that's one example. But there are many other texts in which it's clear that it's considered appropriate for humans to strive to be more angelic, which means to have no free will, to try to obliterate their free will and be perfectly obedient to God, to not feel the temptation of sin, and also to be less carnal, less material. Angels in antiquity were believed to have bodies. They just weren't bodies of flesh and blood. They were more ethereal. They were perfect bodies. And so many of these communities strive to distance themselves from some of the activities of flesh and blood. It's possible that the community at Qumran was celibate, and if they were, it was probably in imitation of the angels, right? They wanted to act and live as if they didn't have a body. And we know certainly early Christian communities, that was also going on. The idea that human beings should escape or transcend their humanness, their fleshly bodies, and become more like divine beings or more like angels, right? This was an appropriate aspiration. So that's the background setting into which I then want to place some of these rabbinic texts, because I think that they are resisting some of that or arguing against some of that. So I want to see if there's anything else I want to say quickly before I jump into the actual text itself, just by way of background. I think I managed to cover most of it. Oh, right. So yes, another little piece of background. One of the things that's so interesting that begins to happen starting around the 2nd century, and another scholar named Peter Schaeffer has talked about this, we see an interesting shift from works that most of the Second Temple writings are talking about the heavens. Enoch is all about humans taking tours of heavens, and the heavens are populated with millions of angels, and they have names, and they have portfolios, and they have jobs, and most of them have jobs as tour guides, and they take you through all the different chambers. But many of the writings in this period are focused on the heavens. And we see a shift in about the 2nd century or the 3rd century to works that are less interested now in the heavens and trying to align ourselves with the will of the angels who govern the cosmos, and are more interested in a more human-centered kind of anthropology. And so much so that we begin to see in rabbinic literature the theme of a rivalry between humans and angels. So instead of other earlier Jewish writings which try to see this real compatibility of humans and angels, and humans are striving to be more like the angels, in rabbinic texts, we have some fascinating texts in which angels are real rivals of humans. They don't like human beings. They think that they're sinful and unworthy of God's time and attention, and they speak ill of them. And there are 3 situations or occasions in which the rivalry between humans and angels in these rabbinic texts, these rabbinic stories, is the most pronounced. Creation. The angels argue with God over even creating humans. Why would you want to waste your time? They're going to be filled with lying. And you all know the famous story, and God has to throw truth to the ground, right? And suppress truth to create humanity. That's a very powerful image. So creation is one place where angels speak up against humans. The giving of the Torah, right? The angels do everything they can to prevent that from happening. They're very upset with God for giving his precious Torah to humans who are sinful and don't deserve it. And then also the descent of the Shekhinah to fill the Mikdash, right, to fill the sanctuary. The angels don't want to be abandoned by God. So those are 3 moments in the biblical narrative where we see many rabbinic stories and legends about these terrible, horrible, nasty, petty, vicious, jealous angels. And some of them are very, very funny. And some of them God doesn't quite know what to do. When Moses comes to get the Torah, for example, God quickly changes his face so he looks like Abraham, and he says to the angels, "No, don't hurt him, don't touch him. Don't you remember he hosted you in his home? How could you possibly hurt him?" He disguises him as Abraham so he can get out with the Torah. So this text is very much in that tradition, and then I want to look at this and then think about what it might tell us about the Halakhic use of this phrase, Lo nitna Torah l'malachei hasharet. Okay, so is everybody with me so far? Okay, this is where we are. All right. So first of all, I'm quite convinced that some of these midrashim were theater. I can't prove this. Of course I can't prove this. But if this wasn't meant to be performed, then I don't know what is. And so I always imagine people, putting on voices. My Moses is very good. I've been told I sound very much like Moses. I'm not so good with Hashem, but, so I do my best for you. But I actually do act this particular one out. So you'll have to bear with me. And the camera might actually have to adjust itself because I do think you have to stand to deliver this particular one. So I will. So that's number 1. I think that it's a fascinating performance and it's a powerful performance. I also think it's a really brilliant midrash on Psalm 8. So Psalm 8 is a very brief psalm, and it begins, we're going to see it cited in the middle of this text, but it begins, "O Lord, our Lord, how excellent is thy name in all the earth." Important. Excellent is your name in all the earth, right? "Who has set your glory above the heavens," right? Oh, shoot, I did have it up here before. I don't know if I still do. Yes, Adonai Adonenu ma adir shimcha b'chol haaretz. B'chol haaretz is going to be important. And asher tna hodcha al hashemayim, who's given your glory on the heavens. And then there's a few verses that say other things, including the important phrase, "What is man that you are mindful of him?" So the rabbis want to know who's saying this, who's being so dismissive of human beings, right? This is a psalm being said by somebody who doesn't think much of human beings. So that's going to set up the story for them that it's the angels who are talking. What are humans that you're so mindful of them, that you care about them so much? So then they must be saying the first verse too, if they're saying the verse in the middle. Now the other thing to know about this particular psalm, it begins and ends almost the same way. Rabbis are always bothered when something's not exactly the same. They have to have an explanation, right? So, O Lord, our Lord, how excellent is your name in all the earth, who has set thy glory above the heavens. But then the last verse is, O Lord, our Lord, how excellent is thy name in all the earth. Doesn't say anything about setting his glory in the heavens. Okay, so with that in mind, here we go. So Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi said, when Moses ascended on high, so now you have to imagine this, okay? You have to imagine Moses and God. If you would like to be God, you can. But they're having this very intimate moment, this tete-a-tete, right? You're sitting there, you're putting the laws on and you're like teaching everything, okay? So there's this whole moment going on where God is getting ready to give the Torah to Moses, and he's getting ready to take it. And they're having this little private moment, and the door is going to fling open, and there are the angels, all right? They're going to be, yeah. What's going on here? What are you giving him? Is that my mother's pearls? Okay, so that's the image that you have to imagine here. It's such a wonderful, and then you'll have to see what God does to get himself out of this. Okay, so when Moses ascended on high, the ministering angels, like the door flings open, the ministering angels said to the Holy One, blessed be he, sovereign of the universe, what business has one born of woman? Notice the language that they're using, right? Hitting him where it hurts. You one born of woman, you come into the world and you die, unlike we immortal beings who are not born of woman, right? So what business has one born of woman amongst us? And God answered him, well, yeah, he's come to receive the Torah. And they said to him, that secret treasure, right, my mother's pearls, which has been hidden by you for 974 generations before the world was created, you wish to give, look at this, to flesh and blood, right? Again, getting them right where it hurts. You know, they're just these material, carnal, flesh and blood beings. What is man that you are mindful of him, and the Son of Man that you visit him? Psalm 8, right? O Lord our God, how excellent is thy name in all the earth, who has set your glory, the Torah, upon the heavens. So first they cite a verse within it, but then they go and cite the first verse of that psalm. How excellent is your name in all the earth, but your glory, the Torah, should be in the heavens, right? So that's the distinction they're reading in that first verse. The Holy One, blessed be he, said to Moses, okay, this is you, like, they've got a really good argument, right? You're really upset now. So he says, I don't know, Moses, tell him why I'm giving you the Torah, right? God has no clue. He has no idea. He can't answer them, and he's befuddled and tongue-tied. Go ahead, Moses, tell them. And Moses says, sovereign of the universe, I'm scared out of my mind. I fear that they will consume me with the fiery breath of their mouths. And God says, hold on to the throne of glory. Give them an answer. So the two of them are sitting there trying to figure out what on earth they're going to say. And he says, you know what? I haven't even read this thing, Moses says. I don't even know what's in it. So sovereign of the universe, this Torah that you're giving me, what's written in it? What does it say? He says, well, it says, I'm the Lord your God. I brought you out of the land of Egypt. And Moses says, oh, that's good. I can use that. Listen, angels. Angels, did you go down to Egypt? Huh? Did you go down to Egypt? Were you enslaved to Pharaoh? Why should the Torah be yours? Okay, what else? Give me something else. What else is written in it? You shall have no other gods. Good. I can use that. Angels, do you dwell among other people with all their other gods that you have to be told not to worship idols and so on? What else? Give me more. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Good. Angels, do you perform work? Do you need to rest? What else? Etc. Right? You get the idea. Well, it says you shall not take the name in vain. This is a pun. Tisa. So he turns that into masa, business dealings. Angels, are there business dealings among you? What else is written in it? It says, honor your father and your mother. Okay, angels, do you have fathers and mothers? No, you don't. Again, what is written in it? You shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal. Is there jealousy among you perfect beings? And I love that. I think that's perfectly ironic, right? Because, of course, the whole point is how jealous they are. But anyway, is there jealousy among you? Is the evil tempter among you? And immediately they conceded to the Holy One, blessed be he, as it is said in the last verse of that psalm, O Lord, our Lord, how excellent is your name on all the earth. And the last phrase, who has set his glory, his Torah, in the heavens, is not written. In other words, they convinced him. So the psalm opens with them saying, your name is praised on earth, but your glory should be in heaven. Why do you care about man? And then Moses and God give them this little talking to, and they say, you're right, Moses, the Torah belongs on the earth. And so the final line of the psalm is that God's great name is on the earth. And immediately, each one was inspired to love him, Moses, and each gave him something. For it is said, you have ascended on high, you have taken spoils, which of course refers to the Torah. You have received gifts on account of man, Adam, meaning that it's as compensation for them referring to you dismissively as Adam. What is Adam? That you care about him, that you instead received these gifts of the Torah. Okay, so as you can see, I love this text. I think it's a great text at many different levels. But the angels are objecting in this particular text that God's treasure, the Torah, can't be given to one of flesh and blood, right? They seem to think that this divine law is somehow transcends humanity, but the whole point that's being made in this text is that it doesn't. And Moses responds, on the contrary, the Torah is specifically designed for. Ultimately, it can only be fulfilled by individuals of flesh and blood, people who are born of parents, people who engage in business, people who have bodies that get tired, people who feel jealousy and frustration. And so the Torah is intended and designed for humans, and humans find their human perfection in fulfilling the Torah in their embodied state, in their morally free state, not by being sort of robo-righteous like the angels, not in trying to transcend their bodies or eliminate their carnal state. All of the things that these earlier ancient Jewish texts and some contemporary non-Jewish texts were understanding to be the perfection humans should strive for, this text is saying, no, this is not the perfection that we're supposed to be striving for. The Torah is given to humans not despite their embodied natures and their discontinuity with angels, but because of it. And the embodied nature of humans is an element of their perfection. It's not an obstacle to their perfection. So, when I thought about that and looked at a bunch of these texts and realized that angels were really treated, it's really funny, some of the portraits of angels, you wouldn't want to be like an angel. You would not want to aspire. They're jealous, they're petty, they're vicious, they're all sorts of crazy things. So then I began to think about this phrase, lo nitna Torah l'malachei hasharit, and I think, well, that's a good thing. And then you go back and look at the Halakhic contexts. So I don't have time to take you through the Halakhic text, but I will tell you what is in common with all four of these Halakhic cases. In all four of the cases where this phrase is used, the embodied nature of human beings in performing the halakha is at stake. So two of them concern the recitation of the Shema. Now, it's a halakhic principle that when you're reciting the Shema, you should avoid being naked or being in the vicinity of nakedness, and you should also avoid excrement. In the first case, nakedness can disrupt one's intentionality, right? The kavanah can lead to improper thoughts that distract you from the intentionality you want to have in the recitation of the Shema prayer. And in the case of feces, it's disrespectful, right, as well as distracting. So, but these two particular cases are dealing with the fact that one can take a concern for these matters a little too far. So the first case is dealing with the case of an individual who aspires to recite the Shema in the most perfect way possible. Does anybody know in antiquity what was understood to be the most perfect way to recite the Shema? When? Oh, well, okay, yes. I mean, short of that, we're not talking about aspiring to die and say the Shema. I mean on a daily basis, on a more mundane level. It's a sunrise, right? As the sun breaks the dawn. This was something that we very, very much, we see this also at Qumran, but to time it exactly with the sunrise, that is an aspiration to do it at the most perfect and precise moment. So what if you are someone who is aspiring to recite the Shema in the most perfect way possible, and what if it is sunrise and you're all set to do this and you're in a ritual bath, immersing yourself in a ritual bath, and you're naked, right? What do? Well, there's lots of discussion. I won't take you through the lots of discussion. You can stir up the water to make it cloudy so you can't see yourself. There are various things that you can do. But at a certain point, someone keeps saying, yes, but you could still be distracted by this, but yes, you could still be distracted by this, until finally someone says, you know what? Lo nitna Torah l'malachei hasharit. Go ahead and recite it. Go ahead and recite it. Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Don't let your embodied nature derail your aspirations to do the holy thing or the sacred thing, right? Don't be so overly scrupulous about what is a fact, a given fact of your nature, your human nature, because the Torah was given to human beings with bodies and with human natures. Don't let that be an excuse to derail you from aspirational behavior. The same thing with the case of distancing yourself from feces, a certain distance, 4 cubits you need to be distanced. And again, because it's the Talmud, of course, and they think of everything, somebody says, but what if there's feces inside, right? That's, ready to emerge. What if you can't distance yourself from that? And again, listen, lo nitna Torah l'malachei hasharit. Don't let that stop you from saying the Shema. Really, you could go crazy. And so don't allow your embodied nature to become an excuse to not engage with the sacred realm, to not be holy. The two other cases have to do with working with sacred materials. There's the fear that in building the sanctuary, and you're dealing with sacred materials when you build the sanctuary, And you cannot use sacred materials for a non-sacred purpose, right? That's me'ilah, that's sacrilege. And so the fear is, well, what about the workers when they're building the sanctuary with these sacred materials? They're going to get tired and they're going to lean on the wall. And they're making, profane use, if you will, of a sacred substance. And again, this is the answer. Don't let the Torah wasn't given to ministering angels. It was given to human beings with bodies. God knows that and understands that. Don't let that be an excuse to not build a sanctuary. And the last one is also a case of the priest. When the priest is finished with the sacred service, he's wearing the sacred clothing. And again, he's not supposed to derive any personal benefit from the sacred clothing. That would be me'ilah. So there's the wonderful question that, what does he do the minute the sacred service is done and he's got to, walk back to the dressing room or what, to take the clothes off? In that, 30 meters that he's walking, he's making profane use of the sacred vestments. And again, the answer is, so should we have no service, right? Should we have no sacrificial worship? No, the Torah was given to human beings. No one expects you to be able to do the impossible. So all of these passages, I think, acknowledge and accept the reality of our embodied nature. And that should not dissuade us from sacred actions. And I think this phrase is therefore exactly the opposite of what it has been taken to be in the tradition when people hear the phrase and they don't look at its actual context. They think it's a way of saying you don't have to bother to do something. It's the opposite. It's saying do it anyway, aspire, right? And don't allow this to become an excuse not to do that. So while the phrase might appear to on the surface to promote a certain kind of laxity, in fact, it encourages and enables a certain kind of aspirationalism. And I think it's an important halakhic and ethical principle that embodiedness and the features of our human condition are not antithetical. They're not the opposite of an aspirational orientation towards Torah, because Torah is intended to be fulfilled by, is designed to be fulfilled by embodied being, morally free beings who are tempted by sin and so on. We certainly are no angels, and that's a good thing. We should be striving for a human perfection, not an angelic perfection. That means a perfection that encompasses and is predicated on our capacity for moral choice, the possibility of sin and failure, the possession of a physical body with all of the limitations that that implies, and those are qualities that angels, to their dismay and frustration, are simply not lucky enough to possess. So thank you. I hope that was within the time.
It was.
Oh, good. Okay.
Yeshua.
Right, that's a real hard act to follow in every sense of the word.
How's your Moses?
I'm not even going to try. But fortunately, I don't have to, because this is not quite the yeshiva style. I'll be happy to comment after my my own presentation. I'm really going to give the reason why I chose the sugya that you have before you, which is one text from Bava Metzia and another couple of short texts from Sanhedrin, is because this is really a very interesting text which suggests a very outlandish kind of incident story, and you can understand it on a number of layers, both on an ethical layer and on a stylistic layer, and I'm sure that it's studied on many different layers. And I'm just going to give you really the way that we would study this in a yeshiva environment, with all of the kind of intricacies and nitpicking kind of which exemplifies Talmudic studies in yeshiva environment. But I think it'll give you a kind of taste of the kind of leanings or assumptions that the average yeshiva student will come into a text with, and the sort of results that you might expect after studying the sugya. So I'll go straight into it, and we'll see what will come out at the end. It's intricate but interesting. It's a fascinating sugya. So let's read the first one, Bava Metzia 62a, right? Samach Bet Amud Aleph. So it goes like this: if two are traveling on a journey, okay, two people traveling, and they're far from civilization, they're in a wilderness, a desert, far away from any kind of human life. Now, one has a pitcher of water. If both of them will drink the water that they have in their pitcher, in their one pitcher, they will both die. But if only one drinks, he can reach civilization. If one of them drinks all of the water that he has, he'll be able to reach a civilized area and he'll be able to survive, whereas the other one obviously won't and he'll die. So there's somebody here called Ben Petura. He doesn't occur elsewhere in the Talmud, which is a question unto itself, why he should appear here. But that's not the kind of question that involves you in yeshiva, so we'll pass on that one at this stage. Right, the son of Petura taught, it is better that both should drink and die, rather than one should behold his companion's death, which sounds like a very extreme and even counterintuitive kind of opinion. It's better that both should die, rather than one live and the other die, in order that the one living shouldn't see his companion's death until Rabbi Akiva came and taught that thy brother may live with thee. The pasuk is, right, V'chai achicha imach in Vayikra. Your life, right, thy life, takes precedence over his life. So, intuitively, we can understand Rabbi Akiva's position here, right? Rabbi Akiva is saying, you're the one with the water, so you have the right to drink the water that you have in the pitcher in your possession, even though that means that you're going to be the sole survivor from this journey of two companions. But the difficulty is the first opinion, Ben Petura, right, the son of Petura, that he said that it's better that both should drink and they'll both die, meaning they'll share the pitcher of water and they'll both die, rather than one drink and the other survive. So the obvious question is, what's the meaning of this first opinion? And beyond that, if we look at the wording, so the Talmud says, until Rabbi Akiva came and taught. Right? What's the word until? So until, the implication of the word until is that without this interpretation, right? Without this hermeneutical interpretation that Rabbi Akiva makes from the verse, from a biblical verse, then he would actually agree to Ben Petura's Halakhic ruling. Right? That's the seeming implication. When the Talmud says until Rabbi Akiva came, that means, or that implies, that until Rabbi Akiva came and said this, we had no way out. Meaning, Ben Petura would be the normative, the more, I suppose, intuitive or more understandable approach, unless you have an interpretation, a derivation from a verse that tells you the contrary. So again, I'll put in as an aside that scholars might ask, did Rabbi Akiva really think this before he had his interpretation from the verse or not? But again, in yeshiva, you wouldn't ask that, and you would take really things at face value. Meaning, if that's how the Talmud portrays it, then that's how the Talmud wants the reader to understand it, and that's really how you learn it. That's how you study the text. This is what the Talmud wants you to understand. The Talmud wants you to understand that until you have an interpretation from a verse, then your basic understanding of this situation is Ben Petura, meaning the opinion that both of them should drink this pitcher of water, and both of them will die on this tragic journey in the wilderness. None of them will survive to tell the story. Okay, this is very tough. So the general approach will be, let's find out what's going on behind the scenes in a normative background understanding to this situation. What else is going on here? Not in an ethical sense, but in a halachic, legal, normative sense. What's the background? What else can be involved? Which other mitzvot, which other precepts of Jewish law can be involved in this situation that might help us clarify this difficult position? And to understand that, we'll go to the next text, okay? This is in Sanhedrin, in Daf Ein Dalet, right, 74a. Okay, you have it, that's the next text over here. And here we have really another legal principle that relates to a similar concept, and we'll see how it might be applicable to the situation of the two people walking in the wilderness, in the desert, with only the one pitcher of water between them. Okay, so we have here Rabbi Yochanan, right? Rabbi Yochanan said, in the name of Reb Shimon ben Yotzadak, these are more classical authorities than Ben Peturitz, certainly. So Rabbi Yochanan says as follows: it was resolved in the upper chambers in the house of Nitzah, meaning it was decided in a certain setting, in a certain sitting or setting of the Talmudic authorities, that in every other law of Torah, in every other, meaning apart from the following exceptions, if a man is commanded, transgress and suffer not death, he may transgress and not suffer death. Meaning, if you have a mitzvah, you have a religious obligation, and somebody's threatening you, either transgress the religious obligation, or this will be your last deed, okay? Meaning either, and unfortunately the Jewish people have had this situation on no few occasions throughout their history, right? Somebody comes and says, either you eat the bacon, right? Or you die, okay? So what do? The answer is you eat the bacon with the eggs or without, and you live. You don't die because of your aversion, because of the religious obligation to refrain from eating the bacon, okay? The Torah prefers that you should live rather than you should refrain from the transgression and sacrifice your life, okay? With the following exceptions, right? Excepting idolatry, incest or adultery, and murder. Okay, these are the big three. Okay, this most people know. We have the big three transgressions. That this is the primary, one of the primary sources that actually presents them in the Talmud. And over here we find that with regard to everything else in the Torah, so the general law is transgress and live, right? Which we learn out also from a verse, V'chai b'hem eile. These are the mitzvot that a person should do and live by them. And the Talmud actually derives from that verse, you should live by the mitzvot and you shouldn't die by them, right? Live by them and don't die by them. But there are three exceptions, and the Talmud proceeds to supply sources, biblical sources, for each of these exceptions to the rule. That in these cases, a person is expected to give up his life rather than transgress. So I'm going to just read that the next continuation of the passage that we have is the continuation of the Talmudic passage, the sugya, with regard to murder, because we're interested now not in idolatry and incest, but rather in murder. So how do we know this of murder itself? How do we know the principle that you should die rather than transgress the prohibition, the transgression of murdering somebody else? Says the Talmud, and this is one of the very, very few occasions that we have a Talmudic precept which is based on human logic, on common sense. Says the Talmud, it's common sense. Even as one who came before Rabbah and said to him, the governor of my town has ordered me, go and kill so-and-so, if not, I will slay thee, I'll kill you. He answered him, let him rather slay you than you should commit murder. And what's the reason? What's the logic? So says the Talmud, the logic is very clear, because who knows that your blood is redder? Perhaps his blood is redder. Meaning, we don't have the tools to evaluate the value, the worth of each and every person's life. So when somebody comes and threatens you, either you murder somebody else or I'm going to kill you, so you don't have the right to take that person's life. Because who knows that your blood is redder than his? Who knows that your life is more valuable than his? Perhaps his, says the Talmud, perhaps his blood is redder than yours. And that's something that we as human beings can't judge. We can't judge whose blood is redder than whose. So now the question is like this. The Talmud supplies us with a straightforward case of actually being threatened with your life, where the alternative, the other option of saving your life, is by killing somebody else. But what would happen in a case where you're not being ordered to actually commit a murder? However, you're being instructed to take part in an action that leads to the death of somebody else, where you are a passive participant. Okay, for instance, let's say somebody takes you by the hands, okay, lifts you up, and says, I'm going to throw you on top of an innocent baby. Unfortunately, we're busy with innocent lives recently, but in this case, a very hypothetical situation, okay? We take somebody and we threaten him. Either you remain passive, you don't shake around, you allow me to throw you on a young baby and allow the weight of your body and the force of the impact to kill the baby. And if you don't allow me to do this, then I'm going to kill you. So what would happen then? Okay? What would the Talmudic ruling be in a case of passive murder rather than active murder? Right? How would you go about analyzing or deciding such a case? Yeah, go ahead.
But is it really passive? I mean, he's asking for your permission. So you do take an active part in it.
Well, you take an active part in not objecting. Okay? He's lifting you up and he's throwing you. And you know that if you're going to start, playing around and stopping him from throwing you at the baby, then he's going to kill you. Let's say you know that. So you don't tell him, go ahead, throw me, but you just don't object. You just sit there passively. So what would we say? Go ahead.
No, I'm not trying to answer. I'm just trying to understand whether it has to do something with family. Maybe it's because of the age of the baby. That's why it has some sort of permission to do that. The Gemara likes to differentiate between family and...
The Gemara does differentiate between an unborn child, a fetus. In another sugya, not exactly here, but close by, the Gemara actually differentiates between the life of an unborn child, a fetus, and the life of a born child. But once he's born, then everybody's the same. Right? Meaning if it would be a case of murder, then there's no question that the murder of an infant would be the same as the murder of an adult. Those two things are morally or legally equivalent in Talmudic law. Okay, go ahead.
We should ask what are the boundaries or the border of the responsibility of upon his body?
A person's responsibility for his own body. Okay, meaning if it would be, let's say, passively, but not involving your own body, let's say some other passive element, then you would say it would be different. But if it's your own body, then it's a different story. Interesting idea. Okay, go ahead.
If my sugi, why is his blood is better than yours, is something that's not just a rhetorical device to say that all human life is valuable, you can't take it away. If it's as you presented it, that it's actually saying the reason you're not allowed to kill somebody else is because maybe they actually are more valuable than you, then I wouldn't think that the active or passive aspect of the situation described wouldn't make as much of a difference, unless it's just a rhetorical device used to show that human life is something that's...
Okay, well, I'll stop it there because it is... We'll pick it up later with more calls from the floor. I'm happy to do it, but I'll pick it up there because I just want to point out an interesting thing. That one of the major commentaries on the Gemara is the Tosfot. And the Tosfot says exactly the opposite of that. Interestingly, the Tosfot says like this. Tosfot says, what's the rationale behind the legal ruling? The rationale is, who says that my blood is redder than his? Meaning, I can't take his life because perhaps his blood is redder than mine. So says Tosfot, for the same price, you can say the contrary statement, right? Who says that his blood is redder than mine? Perhaps my blood is actually redder than his. And therefore, Tosfot comes up with a ruling that when it comes to a passive killing, right, meaning when I'm not taking active action in performing an act of murder, but I'm just passive to an act of murder that somebody else is performing, so says Tosfot, then you don't have to object. Because who says that his blood is redder than my blood? Perhaps mine is redder than his, I don't know. And if my blood is redder than his, then by objecting to what the person is now doing, throwing me at the baby and killing him, by objecting to that, I'm actually interfering with the situation as it is. The situation as it is without my interference is that the baby dies and I live. If I interfere with that, then I am actually making a decision and saying that his blood is worth more than my blood. His life is more worthy than mine. So I actually shouldn't interfere, and I should allow myself to be thrown onto the baby and let him be killed rather than sacrificing my life. That's what Tosfot say. However, let me just present the other side of the opinion, because as with almost every sugya, as we know, there's often disputes, right? Machloket is one of the beautiful things that we have in Talmud so much, that virtually every subject involves some fascinating dispute, and we have to understand both sides of the dispute. So over here we also have another side of the dispute, and the other side is voiced by Maimonides according to one interpretation. I won't go into the details of how it's derived from the text of the Rambam of Maimonides, because it's involved. It's one of the texts that actually is presented by Rav Chaim Soloveitchik of Brisk, one of the leading Talmudists of the, perhaps developed even an independent kind of Talmudic method. But he derives from the Rambam that the Rambam Maimonides actually disputes this and maintains that even in a case of passive murder, meaning even in a case where somebody is threatening to throw you on a child, right, at the cost of your own death, then you have an obligation to object, right? Your legal obligation is to make sure he doesn't throw you on top of the baby and kill him, even at the cost of your own life. And then the question is, well, surely the Talmudic text, surely Tosfot has a good point, right? Perhaps his blood is redder, perhaps your blood is redder. So why should you object to your being thrown on top of the baby, right? And taking his life? Why should you object to that when that involves making a very clear decision in favor of the baby's life rather than yours? Perhaps your blood is redder. Perhaps your blood is redder. So, according to Maimonides, or according to this interpretation, so the way in which you read these words, perhaps the other's blood is redder, isn't so much a direct ethical consideration of balance between two people whose blood is redder, whose life is worth more. Maybe his, maybe yours, we can't tell. But rather this goes into the normative framework of a legal prohibition, right? A legal injunction against murder, Because besides the actual prohibition against murder, there's another Torah legal injunction which states not only are you not allowed to murder somebody, but you are also not allowed to stand by and see somebody else losing his life. This is called Lo ta'amod al dam re'acha. You're not allowed to stand by and see the loss of your fellow's blood. If somebody else is losing his life, this is what we would call the Good Samaritan law, right? Mm-hmm. Which actually Israel,
Yes.
the Good Samaritan law in Israel is based on this Shak Chok HaShomrani Atov, right?
Principle, yeah.
Is
Yeah.
2 minutes.
I'll try. It is based on this idea of not standing by the blood of your fellows. So, according to Maimonides, it appears that this concept of whose blood is redder goes into the framework of the prohibition, the injunction against seeing somebody else be killed. And then the statement really that's being made here is how do you know, right? Even in terms of passive murder, the question here isn't choosing to be inactive rather than active. It's not a question of inaction rather than action, but rather it's a question of preferring the other person's life because of the injunction of don't allow somebody else's blood to be spilled. And that spilling of the other person's blood, which you're involved with by virtue of the situation, the statement, the Talmudic statement of who knows whose blood is redder, goes into that framework, into that Halakhic legal framework of not standing on the other person's blood because perhaps his blood is redder. And we actually have a statement of the Jerusalem Talmud that goes as far as to say that a person is obligated to put himself at risk in order to save somebody else's life because we have an injunction. You're not allowed to stand by the other person's life. Well, you might lose your own life, true. You might lose your own life, but who knows whose blood is redder? And once you put that into the legal framework of don't stand by his blood, then that obligates you. And then we can understand perhaps the story of the two people walking in the wilderness, right? Because we have two people and there's one pitcher of water, there's one jug of water between them, and I have it. So what do?
You need to give it.
So I need to give it because I can't stand by and watch how he dies. But what does he do when he has it? Well, he has to give it to me because he can't stand by and watch me die.
Give it to him and run. That's what you have to do.
I'm sorry? Doesn't entertain. Well, what, giving it to him? But he would then have to give it to me, though.
What if you give it to him? Give it to him and run. That's what you have to do, right?
Give it to him and run.
Then he can't give it back to you.
It's better that they should both drink.
It's better.
They both have a chance of living.
Then Batur.
It's better that they both drink. Then they'll both definitely die. They'll both definitely die. And this is actually a question, right? What have we gained, right? They're both going to die. So even after all of this, right, Talmudic pilpul, right, all of this Talmudic very interesting rationalization, but what have we gained if they both die? So says the Chazon Ish, who was one of the leading authorities of the early mid-20th century, what are we going to gain? We're going to gain that they'll both live for another half an hour.
Right.
And that's also worthwhile. I don't have the right to take away the half hour of his life in favor of my eternal life. My life is also not eternal. Right? It might be another 10 years, might be another 20 years. But right now we have half an hour. So let's both enjoy another half an hour of life rather than me or you taking the whole pitcher of water and see the other die. Look at the wording of the Talmud. We can't see the other person die. You can't stand upon the other person's blood. Says Rabbi Akiva, no. There's a limit to this logic. And the limit is a person's own life. Once it comes to a person's own life, Rabbi Akiva has an interpretation based on a biblical verse that says, Adkan, till here, till it comes to a person's life. The Jerusalem Talmud says you have to place yourself in a state of danger, but not an actual self-sacrifice. You don't have to sacrifice your own life for the sake of saving somebody else. I won't carry on because I know, Alan, that I've run out of time, but I'll just present you where this might go forwards in a yeshiva environment, what we might think of beyond this, right? So we would think of what happens if a third party has the pitcher of water. You have two people in the wilderness, and I'm a third party. I'm not in the wilderness, so I have a ice cream van next to them. I'm just in a position that I'm able to save one of them, or the other one, or give them both another half hour of life. So what do I do as a third party? Right, this would be a question that the Talmud doesn't discuss. How can I extract or derive the principle for that case? Now what about this? How about if I can save myself by injuring somebody else? I don't have to kill him, but I can just injure him. Is that permitted? Okay? What about if we're walking in the wilderness and he has a pitcher of water? Can I steal his pitcher of water and drink it up and save myself because my life comes first? So I can grab his water and drink it up because this is the principle. Rabbi Akiva says, my life comes before yours, so perhaps I can grab his water and drink it up and save myself. these are the kind of questions and intricacies that would be interesting in a yeshiva environment. Some of them are obviously more practical. And I have to say, these sugyas, right, even though it sounds very kind of outlandish and not so practical, but these were really, these very same Talmudic passages were the kind of sugyot that were involved when it came to questions like separating conjoined twins, where one of them will die and the other one will live, when it came to other very serious ethical, legal dilemmas. And these were the kind of passages that were used with all of this intricate Talmudic thinking. So that's the case I wanted to present. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I'd like actually to ask each of you with brief, say 3-4 minute comments on what you saw in the other person's workshop. Christine, you go
So
first.
thank you. That was tremendous fun. And actually, one of the things that struck me is the number of commonalities, which I think were really interesting. So, for example, I could have done it exactly the opposite way I did it. I could have given you the 4 Halakhic texts, right? And then we could have thought about the ethical principles underneath those, and then we could have gone and looked at agadic material that valorizes humans over angels. So I could have done it that way. That can be presented either way. And so I think the point is that for both of us, you read texts with texts. That was the first thing that I noticed that I think is very much the same. When you start working with one rabbinic text, you're very quickly led to another rabbinic text. You start to put it in conversation with a third rabbinic text. And that's one of the things that I think anybody who loves Talmud loves about it, is just this incredible dialogue, this web. There's no beginning, there's no end. You just jump in at some point, and from there, the threads start to spread out. They spread out laterally within rabbinic literature, but also diachronically over time to Tosfot or to Rashi or the Chazon Ish or anybody else that you want to bring into the conversation. So to me, that's one of the things that's fun, and I think all of that is a huge part of what happens in almost any place that you study Talmud. You can't study Talmud without doing that. Everything is connected to everything else. So that was one thing I saw in common. The other thing that I thought that was interesting and in common was that each of us chose to look at a passage or a phrase which the meaning of which might have appeared to be one thing on the surface, and then when you dig deeper, it turns out there's another way to look at it, right? So that this phrase about the blood being redder, and I immediately, as I read it, I wrote, so then it comes down to being a matter of relative worth. That sounds odd, or maybe this is rhetorical. I had your idea that you don't know whether it's yours or his. In other words, it can't be a matter of value because nobody ever knows the value, so ultimately you're all the same. So it can't be about value. You could read it as two different ways, and as you point out, both of them are in the tradition in various ways. So, and by the same token, I also felt that here's a phrase which, if we don't explore it further, contextualize it, bring it into conversation with other texts, we might not really understand what's going on. So the third commonality that I saw was that both of us were interested in teasing out from the text larger principles, something that would give us access to a worldview. And I have to say, that for all the differences in terms of normativity, I think ultimately there's the same impulse of wanting to collapse the historical distance. And maybe our motivations for doing that might come from different places. Yours comes from one place. I don't know what sort of strange, sick little mind I have that it comes from me. Whatever. I find this, when I read something that was written 2,000 years ago, and it speaks to me like somebody who could say it today. Does that ever happen to you? And you go, wow, that's just amazing that 2,000 years ago someone thought exactly what I would think if I read that biblical verse, or exactly what I would think when someone presented me with that ethical dilemma. And the collapse of that historical distance, I think, is what's so exciting and so great. So, and I think that there's some element of that going on when we try to tease out the ethical principles, make sense of this world. And that means that we're sympathetic readers. So I disagree with Alan's dichotomy, that somehow Wissenschaft is about unbiased reading. There's no such thing as an unbiased reading. Thankfully, in the 20th century, we figured that out, finally. There's no such thing as unbiased readings. When I'm looking at a Talmudic sugya, I'm not dissecting a frog, with gloves on or something. You're in there passionately involved in it, and for whatever, I'm bringing my biases, you're bringing your, everybody isn't good. All the greater good that is, because only when our biases bump up against this text Do the sparks fly and we start to see things? If we all walked in with exactly the same head on our shoulders and read the same text, how boring life would be. So I hope you bring your biases to the text, and I hope you are authentic to the text with who you are. So I think that we're both doing that and trying to understand what's being said, and that's, I think, a sign of great respect. I also think that we both do pay attention to the final form. And you might move a little more quickly to get there and say, well, I don't really care who Ben Petora was, so I'm going to bracket that. And I might linger over that a little bit longer. But in the end, I'm also interested in the redacted whole, right? And so I do think both of us are trying to make sense of it as a final work. I might pay a little more attention to some of the things along the way, but I think that's very similar. And I think also it's really clear from when you were talking that you're also in love with certain features of the text. Right? The fact that it's a labyrinth, as I said before. The fact that it's kind of nonlinear, which I think that's also what excites me. The fact that there's real diversity of context and genres, that's what I love about the Talmud. It's an encyclopedia. You can open it up and find a recipe for indigestion. You can find law that's going to make your eyes cross because it's so complex. You find legends and narratives. You find how to get rid of demons. So everything, you don't know what you're going to get, right? Every time you turn the page, it's some new discovery. So I think that's also one of the things that we would find exciting. And I think the other thing that maybe, I hope, came out in both presentations, and this occurred to me as I was listening, is that whatever we might mean by the word sacred, I think to some extent, the sacredness of the text, I would think, and I hope I'm not speaking inappropriately for you, lies not in the inner words on the page, but in the conversation they begin. Right? That's what's sacred about the text, is where you go from there.
Thank you. Yehoshua, your comments.
Thank you, Christine. I would, you took some of the words out of my mouth because certainly when I was hearing your presentation, I was struck by the involvement, the actual involvement, the passion, the love, if you want, with which you treated these texts, and that's a yeshivish thing. So, this is what it's all about. Again, the idea of seeing a text that occurs in one place and trying to extract and derive meaning from somewhere else in the Talmud is something which we do the whole time.
Absolutely.
And I actually enjoyed the interpretation. I think it's a very nice interpretation. And also the veneration of the text, the respect that we give to the text. I think that's definitely something in common. At the same time, I would say that in the yeshiva environment, you would never have the kind of presentation that Christine gave here, and with all of its beauty and with all of its, no, I mean that seriously. I definitely enjoyed it, but it's not the kind of veneration that in the yeshiva world you would give the Talmudic text. You would give the Talmudic text the kind of veneration that you would never apply literary methods. Let's say this is prose, this is poetry, this is humor. Sometimes when I speak to a good friend, I can also make, a joke about the Talmud. Like in one place, the Talmud says, what's the proof that Talmudists have a sense of humor, right? So the proof is that it says, Talmidei Chachamim bring peace to the world.
Marbim shalom.
Marbim shalom ba'olam. But if you would say that in yeshiva, then you'd be considered a heretic. These are not the kind of things, because in yeshiva, the veneration of the text or the sacredness of the text goes beyond the seriousness with which you pursue the studies, and includes a layer by which you really consider every word to have a kind of normative, ethical, or very deep meaning. And it's not something that you can just, I don't mean brush aside. I don't mean to say brush aside as in a light way, but to kind of explain as prosaic or humorous, for example. So, for instance, in this passage, which is an amazing passage in Shabbat 88. So, in a kind of yeshiva treatment, in yeshiva they don't dwell on these kind of non-legal passages to a great extent, but the kind of things that they would take out from here is, why do the angels really think that the Torah is applicable in the heavens? Don't they know that there's no parents, that angels don't have parents? Don't they know that there's no idolatry in heaven? So what does that mean? So, and they would extract from here that really the Torah, they would say this goes together with other midrashic sources that say the Torah is something really that came before the world, and it can have an application in other worldly dimensions on the level, on an angelic level, so to speak. And it doesn't really need to come down to the earth. But then it does need to come down to the earth, because then it has a much deeper meaning in terms of, and this is why they give gifts to humanity, because they want, even the angels want to have a part in that human transmission of the Torah, because of various other, interpretative ideas that angels are people that stand and they can't walk with it, or they can't advance, because all they have is the mission that they've been given, whereas human beings are able to make a progression and to take the Torah to new dimensions and to actually proliferate and interpret and create in a way that angels can't do. And these are the kind of ideas that we would take out from this passage. Again, always looking for the kind of normative and ethical and meaning, significance that we would be able to draw. But again, I really enjoyed it, so thank you.
So thank you. I think the only thing I would add to that is, I do encounter this a lot, and I don't know how they talked when they were studying texts. I wasn't there, and I know that now we have certain modern notions or understandings of what it is to be reverential or to venerate a text, and I'm not sure that those aren't very modern, and that somehow it's to my mind. Have any of you ever written something that people didn't get? It might have been very serious, and you might have been pouring your heart out about something, and someone thought, oh, this is clearly very funny. He wrote it in a purple pen on the backside of a milk carton, so clearly it's not whatever. They misconstrued, they misunderstood. There's nothing more frustrating to you not to be understood in the spirit or the genre in which you're writing. And I guess I have a little bit of that feeling. I worry a little bit about the mindset that these are great sages, and everything they said was always very serious. And they were dads, and they were husbands, and they were milkmen, some of them, and they were coal burners, right? We know that about some of them, and they did a lot of things in life. And I just don't believe that they always looked serious. And to me, I guess it's venerating and it's revering their humanity to know that they probably spoke in many modalities, and the very same people who can give you some of the most brain-breaking Halakhic argumentation, which I will tell you I love. That's some of the stuff I think is the most fun. It's not necessarily what I will present sometimes in a shiur or in a public environment, but that stuff I love. And if you have read some of my more technical arguments, I love parsing through what's going on. I think that stuff's great, but the very same people are also constructing all sorts of wildly fantastic tales, and I have to ask myself, what were they trying to say? And they were drawing upon the literary genres of their day that were sophisticated literary genres, and so to me it feels respectful to try to enter into that, to allow myself to react to it as a person. And I just think it's awfully funny that God has no answer for the angels. I can't see someone trying to make a serious theological point about that. I think they're making a serious point, but I don't think they're making a serious claim at that moment about God. And other writings are making very serious claims about God. But at that point, at that moment, they're using a kind of a literary trope to get at a deeper truth. So I don't think that when we say that something is in literary forms, that somehow we've now broken its divinity, or somehow we remove it from being sacred, or that when we say something's divine, then we remove it from the realm of any kind of human communication or literary analysis. And I think that's probably the one place where I guess I sit the least well. So I hear what you're saying, and I get that, and I hear that, and I think that might be hard for some people to understand. And I guess it's just that I have a different understanding of that divine doesn't mean somehow, or sacred or religious or any of those things somehow, like the text. It's not given to angels, it's given to human beings. Right? It doesn't mean that it's divorced from all those modalities within which we make connections and understand the world.
I definitely understand.
Yeah.
I hear where you're coming from, but just one word about that.
But I won't walk into a yeshiva and do this, is what you're telling me, right?
That's
okay.
That's a good tip.
I'm warned.
That's a good, healthy tip, a good tip. Beyond that, the one thing just in response to that, is that more or less what I opened with, that in yeshiva framework and in the tradition, so to speak, so the text has a kind of canonical structure, and then we really don't see Rabbi Yochanan as a dad, and we don't see him as a human figure who...
Right, not an halakhic story, but if, you know, sometimes in a
He had
Agadic
10
story.
kids and they all died according to one story,
That's
so that's pretty tragic.
There's amulets, right? He has
tragic.
the bone. With
Right, it's very tragic that.
So in stories they come across as that, but in certainly in halakhic conversations,
when the Talmud, when the Talmud presents to us a text, then and this is again the traditional approach. Although I enjoy your work and I can definitely identify with it. Just like we would do to the Iliad or the Odyssey or to other literary works, and I think that's a legitimate approach. But within the tradition in the yeshiva world, it tries to extract that that normative meaning, so it's become a canon.
Sure, and I think if I were looking at if I had started with the halakhic text, it would have been something different, right? I was focusing on the Agadic text to then contextualize the halakhic, but you're absolutely right. So I'm supposed to give a presentation at Ma'ale Gilboa in January, so maybe I won't do that particular. I can do it at Ma'ale Gilboa. I'm very nervous about that, actually. I'm not sure what I'll do there.
Okay, look, we started 10 minutes late, which gives us a little bit of room to work with to get some questions. So why don't I take 3 questions? Must be short. Must end in a question mark, as my colleague Diamark said. And we'll take 3 and then allow you to respond to whichever you.
And we'll be short and brief too.
Let's start with Efrat.
Okay, so it might be not very polite, but I'm Israeli, so I have an excuse.
Oh, I think I know. I think I know what's coming.
Did you at some point were envy in Jewish people, like Jewish from birth, and they asked that as a woman, an observant woman? Is that?
I missed the key word in your first sentence. Did I ever?
Envy the Jewish people.
Yes.
Yes. And I asked that as an observant woman, Halakhic woman, Jewish woman. Is that makes you feel like some sort of?
Efrat asks, as an observant Jewish woman, did Professor Hayes ever envy people who were Jewish from birth? And now it's Levi Cooper. Can you do this, please?
Thank you. My question focuses on, you spoke towards the end about the differences in the 2 methods. I think we also need to consider the different goals of the two different methods. What is the academic approach trying to achieve, as opposed to what the classic yeshiva approach is trying to achieve? And I call your attention to another Harry Potter reference. You've mentioned the timepiece, the time turner, earlier today. So if we don't call something what it really is, if we're not looking at it, these words, are we really, if we're not careful about what we're actually reading, are we really reading the thing that we're reading, or are we reading only our assumptions?
That's 2.
Eliyahu. Over here.
I would like to ask a more informative question. How many people do study today? As you said, when you studied in Harvard, Talmudic studies weren't available. So I would like to ask how many people study today in Yale or around the US Talmudic studies, non-Jews, and do you think it would have any effect on the way the Talmud is studied today in Israel or?
In yeshiva, you mean? Would it have an effect on how it's studied in yeshivas? Okay, so Christine, why don't you go first and then Yoshua?
I guess I was surprised by your question, which I think must mean no, because I think if I recognized the question, I would have thought, yes. So I guess envy has never been a part of the picture. Also, it's something that I really encountered relatively late in my life, so it's not as if I grew up aware of this other world, something I really encountered very late in my life. And certainly when it was something that I encountered, there were certain things about it that just rang, there was a resonance, there was just a comfort level. I'm comfortable with argumentation. I'm comfortable with the comfort that is so evident in Jewish culture with intellectual activity. That's something that I feel really good around. I mean, there were just many things about the culture and the tradition and the people that felt like I was coming home in a weird kind of way. I can't explain that. I don't know why that's the case. It just was. So, but I don't think the word envy ever crossed my mind, actually. It was just, this is some place that feels really good and where I want to be spending all my time and energy. So I don't know if that really answers your question. In terms of the goals, so I guess I want to push back a little bit against the idea that I sort of represent an academic. I mean, that's my job. Yes, okay. So I do that, and I publish articles, and there are certain things I have to do to publish articles, but I do a lot of other stuff as well, and I do a lot of scholar in residence weekends at synagogues and talk to Tikvah groups and do lots of other sorts of things as well, which if one was strictly dissecting the frog, one would really not care about. I think that those approaches actually do infect one another. So, infect isn't the right word, it's a negative word, but you know what I mean, if I could find a positive equivalent. So I do think that when I'm teaching these texts, when I teach my Hebrew Bible class too, I hope that I convey the same sort of thing when I'm reading those texts. I really think that your description is exactly what an academic should be doing. I think you should be lover and chief of whatever it is you're teaching. And I'll give you an example. I also teach an Introduction to Judaism course. I call it Bible to Boober and Beyond, right? It's one of these courses in one semester where you try to think covering the Bible in one semester is crazy. Try all of Judaism, right? So I have 3 lectures in the medieval period, and one of those is devoted to mysticism. And it fascinates me that at the end of the class, this has happened on more than one occasion, students will always come up to me and say, I know which part of the class you love the most, which is really what your secret, the mysticism. He says, because when you give that lecture, you're so involved and passionate. Well, I have to tell you, I don't have a mystical bone in my body. I really have very little patience with mysticism. It's probably the part of the Jewish tradition that I know the least about because it just doesn't interest me very much. And yet students will tell me, and I'm very conscious of the fact that if I'm charged with the task of conveying something to someone, it's my responsibility to get inside it as best I can and to understand it from the inside out and give the most sympathetic portrait that would make sense to someone who really is committed to that. The most sympathetic portrait that I can when I teach that. So I like this idea of lover in chief. Sometimes it's work because it doesn't come naturally. Sometimes it comes naturally. So when it's biblical, rabbinic, Talmudic tradition, it just comes naturally. It's not work. I don't have to do that. I think it's great. Does that mean that there's not anything in those materials that makes me angry? No, by the way. No. There's stuff in there that makes me angry. There's stuff in there that I hope makes other people angry too. And I think that's also part of being authentic to the text and bringing yourself to the text. We're not simply there to be a passive sponge. I'm supposed to be interacting with this text, and that's what I love about this tradition. It's a conversation, it's argument, and sometimes I disagree. And my best friends are the friends that I can say, I don't like what you just did, and they're still my friends. And that really is, I think, a respect that we have to pay to the Talmudic text as well. You have to be able to react authentically if there are even things that bother you. So that's also part of it. So goals, I don't know what the goals of academic study are. Just I want to understand the text, get inside the text, and I want to convey that to students so that that is a part of the world they experience and that can enrich their lives. If that's what I do when I publish articles, great, but I don't know. Those hats get all very blurred for me. And the third question was...
How common is Talmudic study in the academy?
Well, there used to be 2 of us, non-Jews. Charlotte von Robert and I were the first 2 non-Jewish PhDs, and then she converted. So she left me all alone. I said, Charlotte, what are you doing to me? Anyway, so there aren't a lot of non-Jews pursuing Talmudic studies at the very highest level, at the PhD level. It's not really something I think about. I am very used to the fact that I'm not Jewish. Other people are not. And I have to remind myself of that when they meet me, they're still going through well, you look at that, a dancing bear, right? They're still doing the whole dancing bear thing. I'm so far beyond the dancing bear. I've been doing this for I am 54 years old. I have been doing this for 30 years. I am so far beyond thinking it's weird that I do what I do. It's just what I live and breathe. But I get it. I get that for people who meet me, oh, so your name is Christine because, yes, I'm not Jewish. So I understand that. So but I actually don't think very much in those terms and don't pay attention to that perhaps the way I should. But I have read recent articles that this has been something of a topic in the last 2 years in the academy about is Jewish studies still very insular or has it opened up more broadly in the humanities? And there are some people now who are quite vocally lamenting the fact that it still seems somewhat insular and hasn't found a way to really integrate itself in the humanities. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. There certainly are programs all over the world, but do they serve a certain demographic only? Are they integrated in the humanities? I don't know. I like to think that my classes at least draw some people who might not otherwise study this material and know it, and I do try to make it as accessible as possible, but it's hard to know how well that can ever be achieved.
So Yehoshua, perhaps address the question of goals of this sort of study.
Right,
and
I guess
also
that would be
maybe
good.
Eliyahu's second part of his question you could address about the impact of study in the academy on
especially
yeshiva.
Israel.
Right, that's an interesting point. So concerning the goals question, the question of are we only reading our assumptions into the text? Well, of course, whenever you read a text, you approach a text with those assumptions. And I don't think there's any way to avoid that. And at the same time, I don't think that's something that we should be trying to avoid. Meaning, we all have methodological and basic assumptions that each one of us brings to the text when we come to analyze it. And that's a legitimate part of reading a text, meaning I'm coming to the text with a more normative kind of frame of mind, trying to reach the bottom line, the conclusion, what's the text telling me, trying to make it relevant to my life and to the life of my fellow Talmudists and fellow Jews around me, and when I'm writing weekly articles as I do for various publications on Talmudic studies. So if I wouldn't be able to come up with something, I wouldn't have anything to say. So I'm coming in with assumptions about methodology, about what the text is trying to do. And those assumptions are different in yeshiva than they are in university. It's a different methodology, it's a different approach. I've studied Talmud in university too, meaning in my time in Hebrew U, I participated in a number of Talmud courses, just to acquaint myself with what goes on there. And there's something else generally going on there than what goes on in yeshiva. But that's a product of the different goals, as you rightly say. It's true that each person takes his approach, and I think that's fairly legitimate as long as you're intellectually honest about the extent to which you can achieve those goals from the relative text, and you don't actually misinterpret and skew them to a degree that's not plausible within your range of interpretation. So, like Christine says, there are some texts that make you angry, and I think that's very true. There are some Talmudic texts that there's always the golden principle. And this is the more so true about the Talmud for somebody who's a traditional Jew and treats the Talmud with the degree of reverence that we do in the yeshiva world. So you use that golden principle with a very broad paintbrush, right? And at the same time, there are some passages that you say, this one I don't understand. And you carry on if you're a intellectually honest person. So that's what I have to say about that point. About the academic influence, it's interesting. In more recent times, there has been a certain dialogue between the yeshiva world and academia, but it's not really in the hardcore yeshiva environment. It's more in the kinds of research institutions that you have within a kind of yeshiva, the periphery of the yeshiva world, that are dealing with new publications of the Talmud or trying to bring out some new kind of elements that weren't done before. And in this, there's actually a lot of cooperation between academic research and these kinds of yeshiva world byproducts that are trying to clarify, let's say, a Talmudic text, a Midrashic text, a text of some medieval interpreter that hasn't been dealt with over the past few centuries and is recently discovered, like the Me'eri or like the Or Zarua, texts that are fairly recent discoveries and need a lot of cleaning up and work in order to clarify the text itself. And in that field, there's a lot of cooperation. At the same time, in the methodology issues, that there's still something of a divide. And the yeshivas are careful to maintain the distance or the distinction between what they do in the yeshiva world and what's done outside, at least the yeshivas that I'm used to. I'm not talking about my legal bar here. which is a place I love. I know the teachers there, but it's a different style of yeshiva, which I'm not so familiar with. In the yeshivas that I know, in that like yeshiva world of the communities that I belong to, then they try to keep that a very traditional, insular, inward-looking tradition that's not influenced by modern trends of academia.
Actually, I'm sorry, just one follow-up that occurs to me from what you were saying and Eliyahu's original question. It is Eliyahu, I think.
Yes.
I think there's also a difference between the Israeli Academy and the American Academy too, and that might be one of the reasons I don't feel quite the sting of this dichotomy, because as much as, you know, at Yale and the various places that I have to do with here in America, we certainly use critical methodologies. At the same time, we are very much focused I'm at a liberal arts institution. I'm teaching students who are interested in pursuing the liberal arts and the humanities and asking the big questions, as I was trying to do 30-something years ago. So I think that I am very conscious about doing my analyses, but never stopping there. That's never the goal. That's never the end, right? There is that in the end of at the end of the day, I want there to be a text on the table.
Well, what's he saying? What's he telling us?
Right, and I want to understand the world behind there, and I want to collapse the historical chasm, and I want people to feel excited about this. And I may be unfair, but perhaps that isn't part of the goal of what happens in academic Israeli environment. But I think for those of us who are involved not only in research but in undergraduate teaching in liberal arts colleges in the United States, it is something that is at the forefront of our minds. So we do not abandon that when we adopt our critical methodologies, and that I think might explain some of the commonalities.
What do you know? We end with a plug for Shalom College. I'm sorry. We have to call it an end. But just to say, thank you both very much. Certainly, we didn't bring you up here to be dancing bears, rather to be exemplars of lovers and chiefs and excellent teachers. And you both proved yourself to be just that. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.